Good evening, I'm Barkha Dutt. You're with the Mojo story. The Taliban has a cabinet, and it is a shocker, at least for those who were talking about the Taliban 2.0. That myth is finally buried. Let's bring up a big story today as we look at the hardliners, the terrorists who are part of the team that will lead a new Afghanistan, a tortured Afghanistan. Among them, the acting prime minister, the man who ordered the destruction of the Bamiyan Buddhas during the first Taliban. The most wanted terrorist, Sirajuddin Haqqani, is the designated interior minister. It does not get more telling than that. He is among most wanted terrorists, even by the United States. It is, of course, no surprises there, an all-male cabinet. There's no sign of any women in that new government. So much for a new version of the Taliban. But women are out on the streets taking on the Taliban, even as Ajit Doval, India's national security advisor, is a meeting with intelligence counterparts from both Moscow and Washington. There were many policy wonks who argued in favor of India engaging with the Taliban. But given the shape and form of this government, what would those men and women say today? It would be tantamount to engaging with terrorists. Let's introduce, with that question, our panel of experts on the program today. We're joined by Dr. Patoni. Dr. Patoni Isaaqzai is an Afghan activist. Women may not get a voice in the government led by the Taliban, but they certainly do get voice on this program and on this platform. We're joined by Professor Amitabh Mattoo, consistent in his position that we cannot, as a state, as a country, be engaging with the Taliban. Today, proven right with the composition of that team. And Ambassador Vivek Katju, who I have been having many a running argument with now for many weeks. He was among the first veteran diplomats in this country to say that India must engage with the Taliban. And he was saying this even before the Taliban had taken over Kabul. In a moment from now, we'll also be joined, hopefully, by Jonah Blank, who's worked with Joe Biden and has some perspective on what the Americans might do next. But I have to start with you, Ambassador Katju. Tell me you've changed your mind. Tell me you don't want India and the world to be sitting at a dialogue table with Sirajuddin Haqqani, whose network is held responsible by India for the attacks on our embassy or consulate there, who is responsible, in America's own telling, for the assassination of American citizens, who is an established terrorist. Now the interior minister holds the keys to the security of the new Afghanistan. Are you still going to say that New Delhi and the world should be talking to these guys?
The world is unfortunately what it is. It is not united either on terrorism or on its approach to the Taliban. The government, you say, is a shocker, and I agree. Of course, it's a shock. But I'm also mindful of the fact that today, the Pakistanis have convened a meeting of the foreign ministers of the neighboring states of Afghanistan. In that virtual meeting, there are the foreign ministers of China, Iran, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and Tajikistan. The upshot of that meeting will clearly decide the direction in which the neighbors wish to go. Now, let me clarify at this moment, Barkha, that diplomatic recognition of this government is one matter, and I'm not advocating that at all. But engagement, talking to them, is a process that India has begun. It began
and you're still in favor of it?
Absolutely.
Tell me why.
And I will give you
what is to be engaging with Haqqani as the interior minister of Afghanistan.
I'm not. I say you can look. Let's not be emotional about this. In diplomacy, you may have the luxury of emotion, but as someone who's dealt with India's policies towards Afghanistan for over a quarter of a century. Well, I've dealt with them for a long time. I've been retired for the last 10 years, but I've looked at these issues and I've had interest in India's policies towards Afghanistan. I don't have the luxury of emotion or of choosing the people I engage with. That luxury is not available to me. Just to listen. It may be available to journalists, it may be available to professors, it is not available to those who decide and India's security issues and India's interests.
Okay.
Now, having said that, let me tell you that the moment we decided to engage with the Taliban and the moment in our mission in Doha, the ambassador met with Abbas Tanakzai, who will now be a deputy foreign minister, that engagement process began. And that I'm sure that the highest authorities in India would be aware of what the Taliban are. So it's all right to say Sirajuddin is this. I'm not saying engage Sirajuddin, but you've got to engage with representatives of the Taliban unless, one last point, unless you are willing to allow Pakistan and China to have a full play on your Western neighborhood and abandon your Western neighborhood to interests that are contrary to yours. That is the harsh reality.
All right, let's get Professor Amitabh Mattoo in. Amitabh, you and I have come in for a swipe from Ambassador Katju, which I'm willing to take on the chin, because I am still arguing that we gain nothing. I take Ambassador Katju's point that we can't be emotional, that there is a certain amount of pragmatic malleability that is needed in the craft of diplomacy. But I saw your tweet and you said that those who had argued in favor of engagement with the Taliban should be given a one-way ticket to Kabul. May I ask you, with no disrespect to Ambassador Katju, are you including Ambassador Katju in the list of those that you're going to recommend a one-way ticket to Kabul for?
I mean, I would have, but because he's a fellow Kashmiri, I'll not...
come along, Amitabh, let's not go on that line.
I'll be a little favorable.
Let's not go on that track.
Sir, I did not interrupt
you. are willing to sit with Kashmiri separatists who are totally against us,
but I did not interrupt
who have indulged in violence.
I did not interrupt you, sir.
Okay, Ambassador Katju. Okay, Ambassador Katju, we agreed we would not get emotional. We would agree.
Yeah.
We agreed
No,
that we
I'm
would not
not
get
emotional.
Okay.
But
I just see the dichotomies in these approaches.
No. First of all, it's a very, very sad day when someone who represented India in Indian diplomacy for 40 years, and he's now retired and has the luxury of saying what he wants to say, but that he says that we should engage with a regime which is a fascist terror regime. He would have been sitting in London and advising Chamberlain to do business with Hitler. He would have been...
if you are being personal, then I'll be more personal. Let's be...
I didn't
this is
interrupt
not
you,
acceptable.
I did not interrupt you. Either you let me
I was
continue...
not personal.
Okay.
I said that it's not personal.
Calm down.
You began by saying that you have, that unlike academics and journalists, you have actually served the country, so you are in a privileged position. If you are going to use that privilege to do business with the Taliban and suggest that India should somehow engage with the Taliban, I am in my right to tell you that you are a modern-day Chamberlain kind figure. It doesn't matter.
Isn't that a very personal remark, Amitabh Mattoo? You are questioning Ambassador Katju's integrity for a difference of opinion on a policy that has the world confused. Why would you make this personal comment instead of arguing on?
I said it's appeasement. It's appeasement.
Of who?
Yes,
appeasement of the Taliban.
Let me come in here.
Ambassador Katju, let him just make his argument. I promise to come to you right after that.
Yeah, first of all, it's no one's business that it is that if there for tactical reasons you might want to do a certain amount of business, but to in any way engage in a form, we are not quibbling with words about recognition. Engagement lends legitimacy. I unfortunately have also seen the fact that the Haqqani network, Sirajuddin and company, mounted a 2008 attack on the Indian embassy, in which one of my dearest friends from JNU, who was an Indian diplomat there, Venkatesh Rao, was killed, and the brigadier of the Indian Army was killed. Yes, it is personal for me in many ways, because I've seen what has happened. I've seen the costs of what doing business with the Taliban has meant in the past, in terms of releasing Masood Azhar, Bushlak, Latram. And again, it's personal because Mr. Katju was Joint Secretary there and went with Jaswant Singh during that mission. It is personal in many ways, Barkha, because it hurts me. I'm a Kashmiri and I've seen the consequences of doing business with these people. And anyone who gives me the idea that Indian statecraft has in any way succeeded in dealing with Afghanistan or Pakistan in the last 30 years, please give me a breather. Or I think that any engagement with the Taliban, no matter what the Russians and the Chinese do, will lend legitimacy. And more importantly, what they represent almost everything that goes against the grain of the idea of India, in terms of women's rights, in terms of fundamental freedoms, in terms of bigotry. I will never, it's not a world that it's not as if you're doing business.
Now tell me, you have accused Ambassador Katju of appeasement. You have accused him of being a Chamberlain type figure. What do you mean by that? Are you accusing him of treachery here? Are you accusing him of appeasing the Haqqani network? Who exactly is he appeasing and what is he gaining? When you make a comment
I am
like
saying
that,
remember, Prime Minister, look, let's go back into history. Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain had a choice when he came back from whether to confront Hitler, because Hitler was on the rise and he was conquering parts of it. So Chamberlain has gone down in history as someone who decided not to wage war against Germany and rather look the other way, and in opposition to someone like Winston Churchill, who realized that fascism is going to destroy Europe, fascism is going to destroy the world, Nazism is poisonous. But so if you do business with poison, it will poison, the contagion will spread everywhere. Talibanization will spread everywhere. I have seen extremist movements. I've studied them for extremist movements over 100 years of extremist movements. I have studied them. They can never compromise even when they come to power, because then they'll lose the support of the core base.
Okay.
Anyone who had imagined that Taliban 2.0 will be different was living in a different paradise, or had a completely lack of an understanding of real history. I'm sorry to say that.
All right. I'm going to allow Ambassador Katju a brief interjection there. Jonah Blank is with us. We still haven't spoken to Dr. Patoni. Ambassador Katju, here's the point. Obviously, this is an issue that triggers very deeply felt emotions. You ask us to leave emotion out of it, but Amitabh explained at length. He lost a friend in Kabul. He's lost people along the way that he knows. I'm sure so have you. Would you at least concede that there is no Taliban 2.0? I think the very least we need to do to have this conversation is to acknowledge that everybody who suggested a more moderate, a more inclusive, an altered by Doha Taliban was wrong. Would you acknowledge that at least, Ambassador Katju?
Barkha, there was a direct personal attack on me and my integrity by my good friend Amitabh Mattoo. Let me respond to that attack. I'm a little surprised at the attack from a person who was an advisor and a crucial advisor to a party and to a chief minister who used to advise the Indian state to talk to separatists in Jammu and Kashmir, to talk to people and engage people who were determined to wrest Jammu and Kashmir out of the Union and who were nothing but proxies of Pakistan. Now, I can't find a more glaring example of appeasement than the appeasement of those who wanted to break the territorial integrity of India. Among those separatists are people who have murdered Indian airmen. So I'm a little surprised, and I find it extraordinarily rich when Professor Mattoo has a selective memory and says that evokes the ghost of Neville Chamberlain at my suggestion of engaging the Taliban, which the government has begun. And he entirely overlooks the role that he and the party of which he was a part supported in Jammu and Kashmir. It's extraordinarily rich and hypocritical.
Do you believe Mehbooba Mufti, Yasin Malik are the same as Sirajuddin Haqqani?
Yasin Malik is facing charges of murder today.
I am aware.
And this is the man, the party to which Mr. Mattoo belongs has supported engagement with. I'm not suggesting engage Sirajuddin Haqqani. You talk of losing friends. I've lost friends. I've lost colleagues. The Americans lost 2,400 soldiers. They've suffered a strategic defeat. But great powers suffer this and move on, learning lessons. Okay. My point is, last point. My point is simple. The Taliban, of course, have not changed. Ideologically, they are still what they are. But I believe that India's interests demand not appeasement, but India's interests demand creating space so that you can play in Afghanistan. If you don't, then you abandon your entire Western neighborhood for a long, long time. The Chinese are already there in Pakistan. They've made it a client state. They are active in Iran. They are integrating the Central Asian states. The missing link is Afghanistan for them. They are eyeing the resources of Central Asia. Just let me complete. They are eyeing the resources of Central Asia. At this stage, should we sit back and do nothing, twiddle our diplomatic thumbs? Or do we become a player and seek to create space? The Pashtuns, and we have one last point, the Pashtun, and we have a lady who's a Pashtun. There are dichotomies, there are contradictions between the Mashriqi and the Southerners, the Durranis and the Giljais. Do we allow the Punjabis to have a free run? That is the issue.
Okay. Can I request you both now to hold your fire, keep your powder dry? We'll come back to both of you. I think what's telling is that if this is so deeply felt in India, can you imagine what the Afghan people are feeling today, with the women in particular taking to the streets, taking on those terrorists, and because that is what they are, irrespective of whether they've taken over government or not. We'll play you those shots in a moment from now, those very dramatic visuals that have come out of Afghanistan with women, in fact, leading the way in those protests. But let me bring in Jonah, and then I'll come to Dr. Patoni. We saw the Americans give a kind of muted statement of disappointment with the composition of the cabinet. The cabinet is a bunch of terrorists. It includes a US designated most wanted Sirajuddin Haqqani. Is the response from Washington, enough?
Well, thank you for having me on, Barkha, and my apologies for joining late due to some technical difficulties. I think that at this point, the appropriate response is to let actions speak rather than words. I think we're facing a new Taliban, and it may be worse. This is the point on which I think a lot of observers kind of failed to get their heads around. 20 years have passed. The Taliban of 2021 is not the Taliban of the 1990s, even though some of the people are the same. There's a good chance it will be worse. It certainly is smarter. It certainly is better at using social media. It certainly is better at engaging with the outside world. And they did a much more effective job in rolling over the entire country in the space of a week, when they couldn't conquer the entire country even throughout an entire half decade last time. So I think that we have to look at what they really are today. And Barkha, you're absolutely right. They include one one of the most dangerous terrorists in the world, Sirajuddin Haqqani, and a collection of others who, at a minimum, have been supporting terrorism. So we should definitely, I think anyone who is putting forward the idea that this is a moderate face, I think is clearly off target.
But Jonah, you have advised Biden, on this region. You have been with him to Afghanistan. You told us the last time you were on the program that Biden gets Pakistan. Biden gets the linkages between the Haqqani network and Islamabad. Biden gets Pakistan's patronage of these groups. Yet we've seen the Americans describe the Taliban as somewhat, as almost kind of partners when the attack took place in the Kabul airport. We have a very strongly expressed opinion on both sides of the divide in India, as we just heard from Ambassador Katju and Professor Amitabh Mattoo on talking to these guys, engaging them. If Biden gets Pakistan, why is the response from Washington so muted on the composition of this cabinet?
Well, because, Barkha, in my view, this gets to the issue of what does one do about it. And I think that this is I joined late, so my apology if I'm misrepresenting anyone's views, but I believe that both Ambassador Katju and Professor Mattoo are getting at the same issue from different sides. I don't think either one of them is under any illusions about the Taliban. The question becomes, what do you do about it? And I have a lot of sympathy for advocates of saying, look, we understand what's happening with ISI. We understand that ISI is calling a lot of the shots in terms of who are members of the new Taliban regime. The question is, what's the most effective way of dealing with that truth?
So are you with Ambassador Katju that there's no option but to engage the Taliban? Because Amitabh and I are very much on the other side of this argument.
My own feeling is that no country should be, certainly not India or the United States, should be offering diplomatic recognition. However, one engages without diplomatic recognition all the time. India has been doing that for years. The United States has been doing that for years. One can do that in a smart way or a dumb way. I think the Trump administration did it in a dumb way. But I think that every country that is involved in Afghanistan has been engaged. Even during the 1990s, there was engagement. Engagement does not and should not, in my view, imply diplomatic recognition.
Okay, you're drawing that separation, and I'll ask Amitabh in a moment from now whether he sees a moral or strategic separation between the two approaches. But I must get Dr. Patoni now in as an Afghan voice and as a woman to see a bunch of men, leading your country, to see women being literally the only group left, other than the resistance fighters such as they're left in the Panjshir Valley, taking on. I want to say these men, but so many of them are actually designated terrorists. How do you see this, Dr. Patoni? I know you're not in Afghanistan, so there's a certain amount of freedom you have to speak more freely, perhaps, than those who got left behind.
First of all, thank you very much. I have to just make a comment on the two gentlemen who were talking at the beginning. To engage Taliban or with Taliban or not. I have to say engagement, if engagement means recognition, no. And that should be, absolutely something which we all agree. Any person who believes in democratic values, in values as people, should not recognize them and should not allow this recognition to go. Unfortunately, we are at the stage that we are a bit late at this stage, because Americans did recognize Taliban years ago, and that was when they started talking with Taliban without involving the Afghan government. So that is something which we should say that it was wrong at that point. Now, at this stage, the only thing that we can do is not recognize them politically. However, do not abandon people of Afghanistan. Somehow that humanitarian help, which is the only way for Afghans to live at this point, and the only economical support that Afghanistan has is through humanitarian help, should not be cut off because of the Taliban. However,
So you're saying the engagement might be necessary by the world for the sake of the Afghan people, which is not the same as legitimizing the Taliban government.
exactly, and that should be conditional. I mean, that gives the international community power to deal with Taliban. If they do not recognize women's right, then there should be certain consequences, and all the other things. I mean, human rights. It is the women's right. It is all the press freedom of press, freedom of speech, and
Right.
so on. So these are all the values that should have some sort of consequences if they do not recognize and if they
Okay.
do not do.
Okay, let me just jump in here and take that back to Amitabh Mattoo. Do you accept what all the three panelists have argued, that engagement is very distinct from recognition, that engagement is necessary even if you want to mitigate or extremism, if you want to leverage, for example, the frozen accounts of the Taliban to try and deliver some sort of accountability from these bunch of louts? Or do you believe that actually engagement is the beginning of a kind of mainstreaming, a kind of whitewashing, which we're already seeing? You're seeing these spokespeople, including members of the Haqqani network, now interviewed on Indian television channels as if they're regular folk. You're seeing their representative in Doha meeting with that ambassador. There is already a kind of gentrification, if I may call it that, of the Taliban terrorists that has unfolded. Go ahead, Amitabh.
Yeah, Barkha, I'll respond to Ambassador Katju's direct attack a little later. But first, to answer your question, look, private individuals have met the Taliban. The Pugwash organized conferences in Doha where Stanexai came. Similarly, Russia has organized conferences where previous two former ambassadors went and visited that meeting. So there is no question. I mean, a common friend of Vivek Katju and myself, Rustam Shah Mahmood, has been saying for years. But that is a different story, that you have private initiatives to try and engage with the Taliban. And we should have done that. If we had to do it and find contradictions, we should have done it a long time ago. But we outsourced all our policies to the Americans in the hope that the Americans will never leave. And we abandoned the Northern Alliance, or the Americans made us abandon the Northern Alliance. So engagement with a built-in carrots and sticks is the only policy, and relatively at the track 2 level or non-governmental level, in a way which does not legitimize India's engagement, even though whatever has happened between the ambassador in Qatar has happened. But I think what you need to do is incremental engagement at the non-official level to see, as Jonah Blank said, whether the words will translate into action. The Taliban have assured the Americans that they will not hurt the Americans and their allies. They have given no assurance to India.
They made a bunch of noises.
Stanexai has vacillated between saying something one day, another day. The fact is, the Haqqani network is what you know the Haqqani network to be. They have attacked us. Has Sirajuddin Haqqani, even though he's published an op-ed in the New York Times, apologized to us for that attack, for which we have really a smoking gun, if there was one? Second issue, of course, is I find it morally, I must use the word, and you will pardon me for the expression, morally repulsive and politically naive and diplomatically really out of my depth to respond to this, that you are treating people who are your own people, who are misled, alienated, and who have eschewed violence, having a dialogue with them as the same as engaging with the Taliban. And incidentally, since we are getting into personal territory, Mr. Katju was Joint Secretary PI in charge of Iran, Pakistan, and Afghanistan when the Home Minister of India, one of the strongest Home Ministers of India, Mr. L.K. Advani, actually received the Hurriyat. Mr. Vajpayee engaged with the Hurriyat, and he's telling me that I belong to the PTP. I was a small fry in a small pond, and he was presiding. What I am suggesting is that talking to your own people, alienated, whether you talk to the Nagas, or you speak to the Naxals, or you speak to the Kashmiri, who might be demanding separatism as a goal, but in reality are going to settle within the Constitution of India, Is that the same as talking to the Taliban terrorists? Is that the same to talking to people who have nurtured and nursed bin Laden? I must say, even by the worst of comparison, I must say that Mr. Katju has lost me there completely.
Okay, let's take this to Ambassador Kaju. There is a difference, surely, and you've heard, in fact, many of the Valley politicians say that if you can talk to the Taliban, why don't you talk to us? Is there not, Ambassador Kaju, a difference between trying to mainstream your own people, whatever you may see their politics and their relationships with Pakistan to be, they are Indian citizens, and Sirajuddin Haqqani? You surely do see that difference. That's the first question. The second question, I'm with you when you say don't be emotional, but I'm thinking, what is the leverage actually available? Does the Taliban care when it has China to compensate financially if it comes to that, even if the Americans keep the accounts frozen? When there is this Pakistan-China sort of nexus, what can India really leverage with the Taliban that there's any tactical or strategic advantage in it for us, Ambassador?
I think you've asked me a host of questions, and please allow me some time to respond.
Yeah.
My first point is that the word legitimacy, and Professor Mattoo is a very eminent professor of international relations, and I'm sure Mr. Blank will agree with me, is more apt in the domestic context than in the context of international relations. In international relations, as was correctly said, there is the concept, and it's a very strict concept of diplomatic recognition. States recognize other states. States recognize governments of those states. Legitimacy is an issue which is best left alone and left to the domestic context, because if we open this box of legitimacy, then it can have very, very major consequences. I am not advocating diplomatic recognition of the Taliban government at this time. Point 2 is, to my mind, any Indian citizen who attacks the territorial integrity of India is beyond the pale. Any Indian citizen who kills 8 airmen cannot be called as someone who is misled. And I find it extraordinarily naive to believe that someone who was instrumental in murdering in cold blood 8 airmen who were on a pavement, if my memory serves me right, waiting for a transport, has become transformed. He's become a Gandhian. He now believes in non-violence. He says he believes in non-violence. Is that gullible or is that realistic? And I don't, it's my view that I'm expressing. There are political leaders and they're very wise political leaders, and I leave their wisdom to them. Third, what do you do in this situation? I think our friend Jonah made this absolutely the right point. What do you do but engage these people for a variety of reasons? And the first reason for me is India's interests. And my last point at this stage, I'm happy we have a Pashtun lady with us. Even when Pashtuns are completely dependent on someone, they still nurse a great sentiment for independence. I have yet to meet a Pashtun who is led by the nose by someone else. I've known Pashtuns. They've been friends. And I do believe, just allow me 2 more sentences. And I do believe, even at this time of complete dependence on Pakistan, in policy and practice, as we proceed to see the unfolding of events in Afghanistan, we will discern space being created between those who are now in power in Kabul and those across the Durand. For one,
Okay.
the Durand will remain the Durand.
Okay.
So
Okay.
let us, so that is my point. There is a space. Should India just abandon that space on account of moral reasons, or should India, like the Americans, look coldly and in a realpolitik manner at its interests?
Okay.
That's all that
Okay.
I'm saying.
Okay, fair enough. Jonah, let's bring you and Dr. Patoni in, and then we'll get last comments. Jonah, I think you raised the existential question: what does the world do? Let me cynically say to you that all this talk about negotiations, so that maybe we can get them to moderate themselves or give some guarantees on civil liberties, on the rights of women, or against terrorism. Why does a triumphalist Taliban that has defeated a superpower need to do this? Why does it need the Indians? Why does it need the Americans when it has China and Pakistan? It has the Russians willing to do business with it. Right now, we've had the CIA chief, the Moscow NS security, top security officials in Delhi. We've had the MI6 passing through, but it's not actually clear what is being sought from India and what the leverage is left in this region with the China-Pakistan nexus. Jonah Blank, go ahead.
Yes, Barkha, you're absolutely right that it's far from clear that the Taliban needs anything from the United States or let alone from India. However, it's quite possible that the Taliban wants some things, certainly from the US and possibly also from India. When I was a US government official back in either 1999 or 2000, maybe even early 2001, the Taliban sent a delegation to Washington. They met with members of the administration and with people in Congress, and they met with me. And they had a number of specific asks, most notably an increase in the UN's food program. And this gets to Dr. Patoni's excellent point, which I think we have to all bear in mind. Without engagement of some sort, the outside world cannot deliver the food aid, the humanitarian aid, upon which millions of Afghans are going to very soon be reliant. So even if we don't want to do anything more than get humanitarian aid flowing, we still have to have a channel for that to happen. And it's quite possible that India and certainly the US will have enough leverage to get even more than that. I'm not very optimistic that the outside world is going to get very much more than humanitarian aid. But at a bare minimum, unless we want to simply wipe our hands clean of Afghanistan, we have to have some channel for the discussion.
But you don't think that the danger with that approach is that you begin the mainstreaming of the Taliban, even with India and the chair of the United Nations Security Council, Jonah, there is a kind of beginning of the recognition of the Taliban as a state actor. And my fear is that this approach incrementally takes us to that conclusion.
And that's a legitimate point. But the fact is that India, the United States, every nation has made a clear distinction between humanitarian aid and diplomatic recognition. The US has supplied humanitarian aid even to adversaries such as North Korea and Iran, which is, of course, an adversary of the United States, or at least a hostile country to the United States, even though it is not a hostile nation for India. India also has diplomatic relations with North Korea. The United States doesn't. But India has provided humanitarian assistance or offered humanitarian assistance to Pakistan, even at times of very high tension, such as after the Kashmir earthquake and after the 2010 floods. Pakistan has often turned this aside, but India has offered it. So I think that there has to be a clear distinction between humanitarian assistance, which does not imply legitimacy to the government in power. And Myanmar is another example.
Yeah, Myanmar is another example where too there have been absolutists urging a different response from India, and I'll put that to Amitabh, and I think the argument would be that the Myanmar junta has not hurt India in the way that the Taliban has, and the stakes are just not directly as high as they are for us with an emboldened Pakistan puppeteering the Taliban. But let me just get Dr. Patoni in. You made the point about the Afghan people needing the help of the world. But as a woman, to see this bunch of men, many of them terrorists, among them the acting prime minister responsible for ordering the destruction of the Bamiyan Buddhas, what would you like the world to understand as an Afghan woman today?
The message that I would have to the world as Afghan women is, please do not forget us. Please do not let us to be under control of a cabinet full of men. Most of them are sanctioned by the world because they are criminals, not because they are good people, because they are criminals. They've always been anti-women. They are still anti-women. And please do not forget us. That will be my message to the world.
And do you feel forgotten today? Do you feel
yes,
like...
Yes, I do. Yes, I do. The point that there are thousands of activists who work against Taliban. Currently, I'm working with an organization called Kabul Luftbrücke, which is the air bridge for evacuation. It's an NGO, and we are trying to get as many people as possible out. We could get 189 people in one plane, and now trying to get others out who are in danger and whom we know will be killed just because they were activists, just because people from the West went and taught them what women power means, what it means to be a woman and go out and work. We empowered them from the West. And now to leave them alone there, it is not fair. And I think that this is happening. And that is something which I really want to shout out loud and say to the world, please, please do not forget Afghan women.
Yeah, absolutely. I do need to take last comments. Amitabh, Mattoo, I'll come to you. 2 points there. One of your tweets actually said that India should do more to try and take people out, in particular from the Panjshir Valley. You believe that was possible. And two, I know you and Ambassador Katju have jousted quite ferociously on this program today, but when he says to you that legitimacy is not something that happens between state to state. You deal with the hand that's given to you in the relationships between countries. For example, we don't go around trying to change the government in Saudi Arabia or the government in Myanmar, and when the Americans try to do that, they're paying the price for that today. What would you say that you would propagate conversations with Yassin Malik, being tried for the murder of our Air Force colleagues, and at the same time seeking intervention from that same Air Force to take the resistance fighters out of Afghanistan?
No, I think there are two issues. One, of course, is the letter of international law. And Ambassador Katju is right. He knows the diplomatic language very well. In fact, he demonstrated that in the Agra summit as well. But the reality is that I teach politics, and legitimacy is not a subject of just diplomacy. Legitimacy is also a subject of the manner in which you engage. And you can lend de facto legitimacy while not granting de jure recognition. You have to be aware of that. The second point is in terms of exceptionalism. Now, everyone knows that the Holocaust, nothing can compare to the Holocaust. It's a once in a 1,000-year event, what happened in Germany and what happened with Hitler. However, there are lessons for the Holocaust and lessons for all of us, which is that if there is an exceptionally brutal terrorist regime, do not compare it with other dictatorships. Now, Saudi Arabia is an antediluvian regime, but it is a regime for which there are various ways in which there is a reform process at least about to happen. Myanmar is a different kettle of fish. Don't club them. Taliban are an exceptionally brutal terrorist regime which is anti-women, which is bigoted, and which is spreading a version of Islam which is antithetical to the true essence of Islam. So doing business with the Taliban is different from doing business with Saudi Arabia or Myanmar or other dictatorships of the past or present. More importantly, what is the great lesson of the Holocaust is, which is similar, and of course the parallels, as I said, you should never compare anything to the Holocaust, but that the doors of Europe and the United States were open to the Jewish people who were able to escape the Holocaust, who were able to escape Hitler's Germany. I believe that India has always been a remarkable host. See what we have done with the Tibetans, who are model refugees. The Dalai Lama is someone who's revered all over the world. We can offer the Tajiks, the Uzbeks, and the Pashtuns who abide by the legacy of Badshah Khan. After all, we have had Pashtun leaders who were Gandhian in spirit and letter. And we have a base in Tajikistan, and if we should make an effort to try and reach out to everyone who stood by us, the women.
Very quickly, what disappoints you about India's response thus far? I need to start.
I think it's been just. I think it's been lackadaisical. I don't think we have. You need an all-of-government approach. You need all the armed forces and particularly the MEA to act with an alacrity which I haven't seen. There might be, as Mr. Katju says, behind-the-scenes efforts. However, this kind of public diplomacy should be upfront there. We should be seen to reaching out to the women of Afghanistan in the manner in which Dr. Patoni spoke 2 minutes ago.
Yeah. Okay, Jonah, 30-seconder from you, and I'll give Ambassador Katju the closing comment on this program. Do not draw parallels with other dictatorships is an argument that I actually agree with. I think there's an apples and oranges conversation going on here. Obviously, there are no abstract theoretical principles. You look at scale, it's all relative. And what we're dealing with here will not just hurt the security interests of South Asia. It can potentially destabilize the world. It can potentially mean another 9/11 attack. It can potentially mean history turning full circle. Quickly, Jonah.
Yes, I think that one should not engage purely for the purpose of engagement. It's what are you actually doing? And India has a lot more leeway in a sense than the US does. India has the ability and the right to simply say it's not worth our engagement. We don't have any interests that are valuable enough. Our engagement will be through military action if needed, otherwise not really our issue. The US has more of an obligation to have a multifaceted engagement, in my view, for humanitarian reasons at a minimum, but perhaps even more, and it really will be conditions-based. It's got to be actions rather than words.
So, Ambassador Katju, that takes me back to where I began. Why does the Taliban need to listen to either India or Washington? Ambassador Katju, yeah.
I'm speaking the Taliban too, Barkha, I believe, being Pashtuns, and I wish our Pashtun friend here would have commented on what the proposition.
Maybe we can get a brief interjection from her before you. Dr. Patoni, would you want to say
about
something
Pashtun
on that?
independence.
Do you believe the Taliban will be dictated to by Islamabad, or do you believe that they will shrug off that control, Dr. Patoni?
They are
not black and white.
Being ISI and waiting for ISI leader to come to Kabul, and then decide about their cabinet. I mean, that shows that everything is in the hand of Pakistan, and ISI is controlling them, and they are listening to ISI. Yes.
And that picture, Ambassador Katju,
look, you are absolutely right, but my experience has taught me a little differently. While I was India's ambassador in Kabul, I met people, my Pashtun friends, young and old, who had lived in Pakistan for years and years and years and still disliked them intensely and still said that, look, we want our independence. So let's not go by what is the present situation. Let's see how the situation evolves. That's point one. Point two, these concepts of legitimacy are much too diffuse. It is better to stick to what I submitted was recognition. Point three, India, Jonah mentioned the option of military action, if I understood him correctly, that is something that India can look at. That I don't believe that's feasible for India, or that India should even conceive of it. We've had the experience of military action taken by the world's preeminent power for 20 years in Afghanistan, and we've seen the result. And point 4, I entirely agree with Amitabh, that we should, of course, be very, very welcoming of all Afghans who wish to come to India and whose bona fides can be established. There is no contradiction in that and in engaging the Taliban. None at all.
Okay.
In fact, engagement, I will stress again, is not appeasement. Far from it. It is an absolutely realistic way of proceeding with safeguarding and promoting your interests.
Okay.
And I do believe that interests are above all. All other things are subservient to interests.
I have to end there, but the ferocity with which this conversation has taken place is a conversation that's probably taking place in capitals across the world. It's just that the stakes are much higher for us as a nation, and I think we all know that. And you know, you're potentially looking at us literally going back to the future with an emboldened series of terror attacks in our cities. That's a lonely decade that India lived, and one that we do not want to live again. But I am relieved that there was at least some point of agreement, even if on a singular point, between Professor Amitabh, Mattoo and Ambassador Katju in the end, after a ferocious debate. Jonah Blank, Dr. Patoni, thank you. Amitabh and Vivek Katju, thank you. We'll bring you all back. This story isn't going anywhere. It's only just begun. To our audience, thank you for watching. Goodbye. It's great to see you here. Thank you for watching our work. If you haven't subscribed yet, don't forget to click the bell icon and subscribe to Mojo Story and support independent, robust journalism.